What's up, gang? This is Nick, and we're hanging out here at the new Zeller House, or as I like to call it, the Zompound, here for some hilarious Hindu and Buddhist-based pranks. No, I'm sorry. I don't know how to be young and fun. I don't think I ever have. I want to show you something that was done in my new home. I didn't think I'd ever get to a point in life where I owned a home, but my wife was kind enough to buy me one. Very recently, so recently that it is as yet unfurnished and we don't quite live here. I want to show you something about this house that is relevant to what we are doing today. I'm about to shoot into my light source. I apologize for that, but that's the layout of this thing I have to show you. Oh my God, look at it. What is this? Important to the story I'm about to tell, my in-laws are from Laos. They came over as refugees in the 80s from a disastrous U.S. secret war there. And they brought with them, of course, my God, their religion, their culture, their language, and everything about them. This is an offering given on occasion of beginning to move into this new home. We have some sticky rice. We have some water. We have more rice. We have some new bowls, plates, cutlery. We have oranges, coconut, papaya. We have some longan. Look at this fruit. If you have access to this fruit, any major urban area with an Asian grocery store will. It is delicious. Go try it. And we have this big fella here, a sugar cane, if you've never seen one. Up at the front, some cut flowers, some candles, and you see 2 candles that were burned all the way down during part of this ceremony done while we were moving in to this new house, or beginning to. We're not totally moved in. Let me get seated here. Why is this happening? Well, it's sort of a part of Lao Buddhism, but it's not really a part of any Buddhism that you would recognize if your knowledge of Buddhism is solely from Buddhist texts. This is done to announce our presence to the Pi, the spirit, or the word my father-in-law used, Tevan, the angel who inhabits the territory upon which our house sits. Everyone has one. Every home, the home you're watching this from, the building you're watching this from, the car you're watching this from, wherever there is a spirit. And that spirit must be pleased. An offering must be made if you enter that spirit's territory. In the course of this ceremony, my father-in-law offered up many Pali language prayers. These would normally be something you'd say as part of a Buddhist chant, part of a Buddhist ceremony, but I'm not talking about the Buddha. I'm talking about the angel that inhabits this place. These prayers are offered up to this angel that inhabits this place, saying, look, okay, these folks are moving in. They are happy to be here. They hope that you are happy to have them. If they cause you any offense, please forgive them. They're just doing their best. Look out for them if you can. If you so choose, please use your power to bless them. And of course, we got an opportunity to make some wishes. I wish to get out of academia. Here's hoping that that happens for me in a successful way. But anyway, the point of showing you this is not to brag about my new house, which I myself did not buy, but instead to introduce this idea. Buddhism, as it spreads into Southeast Asia, especially mainland Southeast Asia, a place with which I'm more familiar than the islands, it gloms onto a pre-existing spirit worship culture. And I wanted to show you this offering because I wanted you to understand that spirit worship culture is incredibly old, predates Buddhism, and is incredibly active today. This is a practice that would be done anywhere in, say, Thailand or Laos, were you to purchase a new home or move into a new apartment in any of those places. So is there any basis for this in Buddhism? Not in the texts, no. Is it a fundamental part of the practice of Lao and Thai Buddhism? Absolutely yes. Look at it. Here is the physical evidence. Now with that, let's get into it. Okay, gang, here's what's going on. So, we are going to cover about 900 years of history in this module,
Instead of letting things drag out to an hour and a half long lecture on Rome, we're going to cut it into two, 8.1, 8.2. 8.1 is going to deal with the export of Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia. It's also going to deal with, my God, if there's Hinduism, that has to push Buddhism out. So we're going to see the rise of what ultimately, again, remember we need to put major qualifiers around Hinduism, but the rise of practices and gods and ways of thinking about the world that get eventually called Hinduism in India, and the victory that they have over Buddhism. Buddhism is going to leave India for the most part and go to Southeast Asia, and it is going to also pass into East Asia. There it's going to pass as what's called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. So that's what we're dealing with this week. We're going to start in 8.1 with South Asia, political changes, religious changes there. We're going to then move to Southeast Asia. 8.2 will be the transfer of Buddhism into China, its real acceptance in the Tang Dynasty China, and then its transfer through Korea onto Japan. And that is going to get our world started. To dig into all this, however, I do want to stay there in China. I want to talk about a fella named Ennin, some problems he has on his pilgrimage, to sort of get to the basic characteristics of some of the transfers of religious ideas and their import, by which I mean importance, not literal import into a place, but also by which I mean import into a place in this world. I'm excited, and I hope you are too. Who is this Ennin fella? Well, in 838 CE, my God, it's all CE, finally. I'm a Cold War historian having to do this, can you believe it? 838 CE, at about the age of 45, a Japanese monk named Ennin, you can see a statue of him here, travels with a delegation of Japanese officials and monks, the last of nearly 20 official delegations sent by the Japanese government to Tang Dynasty China. On this trip, the point for which was for Japanese people to learn what it was the Tang was doing that was making it so successful. The Tang is the largest empire in China since we had the Han, and the Han has been a long time ago at this point. The Han collapses, you get 4 centuries of decentralized power, major disunity in Chinese history. You get a brief attempt by a dynasty called the Sui, who we'll talk about in 8.2, that bring things back together, and then the Tang, the leaders of the Tang, initiate a revolt, and they create China that is fantastically interesting for both historians professionally, as well as for sort of fans of Chinese history. Now, for the most part, fans of Chinese history really like the first half of the Tang, because that is when the Tang dynasty is its grandest, but also its most flexible. This is when Buddhism starts entering as the third great teaching, alongside Confucianism and Taoism, as a religious, moral, but also political way of approaching rule. So the Tang is very open, very flexible. China hasn't sort of solidified the way it will when we visit it in future lectures under the Song dynasty. That's very cool. Professional historians often tend to like the later Tang when it's less powerful, but the society is more economically dynamic. We'll get into that later. What you need to know is that the Tang is incredibly successful. And so we have Ennin, the last of these 20 Japanese delegations, moving to China, and it is not small. 200 rowers powering 4 boats carrying 651 officials and monks, and they're going into China. My God, they're gonna go to a place called Yangzhou. They're gonna find this channel that's been dug. Emperors making their own rivers. In this case, Sui Yangdi, Emperor Yang of Sui, the second emperor of the short-lived Sui dynasty. They're gonna find his channel near Yangzhou. They're going to use that to enter China. Some of these officials are going to go straight on to the capital. Some, like Ennin, are going to go in search of a less political and more moral and spiritual truth. So he's got his Buddhist pilgrimage going on to big sites like Mount Wu Tai and things like that. And something goes terribly wrong. It's not an auspicious start to their journey, although Ennin's travel logs are very powerful. Let's see what goes wrong. Ennin's entry into Tong China is nothing less than harrowing. All right, so what do you need to know? You know that Ennin is on this delegation. You know it is massive. 200 rowers, 4 ships, almost 700 officials and monks, and they are all leaving Japan, headed to Yangzhou in Tong China. And what you need to know here is that they have been given directions. There is the greenish water of the ocean, and there is the whitish water of the canal. And the canal, our Sui Yung Di's canal, this is very important. This is the way in. But things get rough, gang. They struggle to make it. They become unsure. They get a little bit lost. And days into this journey, nonetheless near the shore, but not quite able to find their path, Ennin recounts. At 2 p.m., the water was again whitish. It's already been greenish and whitish before. And the men were all amazed. A man was ordered to mount the mast to look for the mainland or islands, but he still called out that he saw nothing. The wind blew steadily, the sea was shallow and the waves high, and they crashed down like thunder. A piece of iron tied to a rope was submerged, and it only went down 50 feet. After a little while, the iron was again lowered to measure the ocean's depth. It was only 5 fathoms. The envoys were afraid. Some said that we should drop anchor and stop, going on again tomorrow. Others said that we should lower sail halfway and send out boats to learn the depth of the way ahead, and only then gradually advance. The proposal to stop seemed advisable. But, Ennin continues, before we had decided the problem, it was already 7 p.m., and the east wind was blowing fiercely, and the waves were raging high. The ship was suddenly dashed up onto a shoal. In trepidation, we immediately lowered the sail, but the corners of the rudder snapped in 2 places, while the waves from both east and west battered the ship and rolled it back and forth. Since the blade of the rudder was stuck in the ocean floor, the ship was about to break up. We cut down the mast and cast away the rudder. The ship straightway floated with the waves. All on board put their faith in Buddha and in the Shinto deities, and there was none but did pray. Since the ship was about to break in the middle, we rushed to stern and bow. Each of us looked for a place that remained intact. Bilge water filled the ship, which thereupon settled onto the sand bottom, and the official and private goods in the hold washed about in the bilge. Ennin goes on to tell us that once they survive the night, they fashion a raft out of what's left of their boat. They sail adrift at sea until they are eventually found by several Chinese men on a ship and another member of their delegation who's told the Chinese that these ships, remember there are 4, have gotten into trouble and have sent people out to look for them. There are several days of search missions before they finally collect as many of the living as they can, and only then does Ennin, continuing to move on by way of canal carved by Chinese emperors, onto his monastic pilgrimage to learn, as we saw in the title of the piece, to learn about the law. He's on the search for the law. It's fantastically important. What he tells us about Tong society is irreplaceably significant, but my God, what a way to enter this world. But enter it, Ennin does, and he stays in Tong China for 7 years, delayed often by officials, but eventually witnessing not just the Tong China that loves and allows Buddhism to thrive, but a Tong China that goes on to persecute Buddhists for their practices. So here we're going to see Buddhism altered according to Chinese models of empire, and Chinese models of empire altering themselves according to Buddhism. We'll deal with these Sui people who built these canals and that sort of thing. It's all going to come together. One last thing. Here, unlike any other module, you're going to be subject to a little bit of vacation photos with Nick, because I'm not very good at photography, or if you've noticed, anything related to audio-visual technology. I want to pat myself on the back here. You see this PowerPoint slide. Photo credit, ya boy. That is the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an, a city that was called Chang'an, a city that was the capital of many empires, but not least of them, the Tang. So we'll look at where that is in the city layout on a map a little later. For now, let's continue just a little bit more with Ennin so he can tell us the whole global context of this religious political world that we've entered for this module. By the time Ennin leaves his pilgrimage, by the time he makes it back to Japan in 847, he had traveled over 3,000 miles in search of the law, in search of Dhamma. His account is often used to supplement detailed official Chinese imperial histories, and because he's not a member of the imperial, apparatus, it's very useful for that. In Japan, Ennin became an abbot at a monastery at Mount Hei outside of Kyoto. And my Japanese pronunciation is very bad, so sorry. And what he did there was he introduced rituals that he had learned in China. He taught a doctrine of Pure Land Buddhism, an idea that all beings could achieve enlightenment, but not in this world. Pure Land Buddhism teaches that if you are good enough, if you worship the correct bodhisattva, a bodhisattva is someone who almost becomes a Buddha and decides to not quite go all the way to enlightenment and instead use the powers that they've gained through their meditation and progress along the path to help humanity. The bodhisattva Amitabha rules over the Pure Land, which is a place where people who appropriately worship Amitabha go, and from which teaching of the Buddha is restored. We'll get into this probably a little later, but it's core Mahayana teaching for some people, the Pure Land sect, that Buddhism has been tainted, that the truth of the Buddha, his words, are not as true as they used to be, that it's degraded over time. So to get access to the actual truth the Buddha preached, you have to worship Amitabha, you have to be reborn in the Pure Land, from which you can hear the actual truth of the Buddha, and from there, attain enlightenment, attain the deathless, move on to nirvana, which again just means extinction. So in China, Ennin met monks from all over Asia, and that's why we're starting here, despite the fact that I want to talk about South and Southeast Asia. Because in China, Ennin is meeting Buddhist teachers from India, Sri Lanka, places in Central Asia like Afghanistan. He's meeting folk from Korea, and of course he's meeting people on earlier delegations from Japan. And they all are sort of sharing two common written languages, not spoken, written languages. There is the language of their version of the Buddha, Sanskrit, and there is the written language, Chinese. So this is how they're communicating. They're communicating through writing. Ennin could read and write, but he could not speak either of these. So it's a very strange existence, one must guess, to constantly be communicating with these people who are pilgrims also in this land and with whom you fervently want to discuss the truth of what the Buddha had to say, but that discussion is, my God, so slow, because you're writing down everything it is you have to say. Your shared language is written, not spoken. Overland routes through Central Asia, places like the Silk routes, that will become the Silk Road, were used by pilgrims, but also by merchants, soldiers, and refugees. So some of these pilgrims are coming through Silk routes, but other people are also using them. And information was traveling along these routes as these pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and refugees traveled. It's important to always note that the world's people knew about each other and have always known about each other. America's aside, because they're quite isolated, Eurasian African people have always known that there are other people in other places. The world's always been very connected. No society is ever alone. So any Southeast Asian historian worth their salt would really roll their eyes at what I'm about to say next, but I still think it's because it's an antiquated way of thinking, but I still think it's useful for history at world scale. My God, everything that happened on Earth until 1500 is our job here. Southeast Asia can be understood, I'm wincing, they're going to kill me, as a mix of India and China. And there's certain realms of Sinitic influence, China, certain realms of Indic influence, India. It's clearer, say, in Vietnam, the Chinese influence, say, in Angkor civilization, what becomes Cambodia, Indic influence, but they do mix quite a lot. You know, you've got here in South Asia, in India, the development of Hinduism, which is going to be a temple-based religious system. It arises between 300 and 700 CE, and it has sort of two dimensions. There's going to be a public worship component. One has going to have to go to temples, which are the center of many rural communities. And at that temple, you're going to publicly worship Shiva or Vishnu or something like that, guided by a priest of some sort, and this is going to be, you know, about external harmony with the world as well as some elements of one's own salvation. But it's going to have an internal, a private component as well, where you can, you know, sing private songs, recite private poems of worship in your own home to the gods that you choose to gain some kind of control over your own destiny. So that model is going to spread throughout Southeast Asia. Buddhism is going to come along with it. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, but also now in East Asia, so Korea and Japan, you've got the Sinitic model, the Chinese model. And this is going to be, in China, it's going to be blended up with state-sponsored Buddhism that spreads from about the year 200, so very early, far before we're picking it up, on to about the year 1000. And this is going to be sort of interesting, this movement of religion, because India in the year 100 is an undeniably Buddhist culture. Han China, its counterpart in the year 100, is a Confucian place, a legalist place, and China's own, or only native, or if you want to say indigenous religious system, Taoist. Fast forward 900 years, India is an undeniably Hindu place, and it's become China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, Vietnam. These become the core Buddhist places, along with much of the smaller kingdoms in Southeast Asia. So there's massive, massive change that we have to cover in this module. All right, so finally, with that overlong intro done, all the pieces are in place. We can turn our attention just to changes that are happening in the religious and political world of Southeast Asia, except for the fact that it's still picture time with Nick. And I just want to point out, photo credit me, that's a very nice shot of a pagoda in a nunnery in Hong Kong. Okay, but anyway, now really on to South Asia. So as I just said, by the year 100, India is a very Buddhist place. And it was broken into several small kingdoms. Recall from our ancient India module that it's very rare for India to exist under one centralized power. Politically, it's a very decentralized place for much of its history. These kingdoms, as was true of kingdoms last time we were talking about South Asia, they're bound together quite tightly, however, through culture. And here that culture is going to be Buddhism, a shared conception of social hierarchy, and the study of classic Sanskritic texts. So the first evidence for the spread of Buddhism is the Kushan Empire in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northwest India. The Kushan ruler Kanishka, whose dates are 120, his reign dates are 120 to 140, started a missionary movement that pushed what was called the Greater Vehicle, a new form of Buddhism, into Central Asia and China. Now, the Greater Vehicle is going to be called Mahayana Buddhism, Hinayana, the Lesser Vehicle. Between 100 and 1000, Buddhism gains believers outside of India, as we've said, while losing them inside India. Many changes to Buddhism had occurred since Ashoka's time when we were in Module 3. Most important, believers in the Mahayana faith had decided that it was no longer necessary for a person to be ordained as a monk to gain enlightenment. Instead, there were more paths than initially enumerated by the Buddha. Of course, don't tell them, because this is all the word of the Buddha if you are a member of the Mahayana faith. So our new interpreters of Buddhism, calling this new realization that anyone can gain enlightenment, you don't have to be a monk, calling it the greater vehicle, the Mahayana, somewhat derogatorily calling earlier teachings the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. This is more or less akin to what is now called in mainland Southeast Asia Theravada Buddhism. Theravada here meaning the tradition of the elders. They went along enumerating an interpretation of Buddhism that called on people to begin praying to what are called bodhisattvas, and have already sort of said what this is. A bodhisattva is a Buddhist term denoting a being who is headed for Buddhahood. Remember, Buddha just means the awakened one, the enlightened one. There should be, in a great world, there would be very, very many Buddhas, who says, hold on a second, stop this now. I'm not going to go on to Buddhahood completely. I'm going to stay back and help people on earth, spread goodness, that kind of thing. And so Mahayana Buddhists started praying to these bodhisattvas, these beings who are somewhat enlightened, but not all the way Buddhas. And they would pray for them for all the things you would need to pray for anybody for. Easy childbirth, cures for diseases, good harvests, and what have you. I believe I mentioned earlier the Pure Land sect. The bodhisattva most closely associated with the Pure Land sect is Amitabha, so there you have it. Amitabha has all kinds of powers, rules over a completely different realm of existence, but has not gone on to Buddhahood. So you pray to him to enter the Pure Land, but that's one sect of Mahayana. There are many, many sects, the Tiantai and so forth. Not directly related to that, but directly related to some comments on that. This is also a picture that's my credit from the same nunnery in Hong Kong. I'm very pleased with myself. It's easy to be a good photographer in Asia, I think, but probably Chinese folk coming from Asia to the West find ways to make what we think of as mundane little farms look quite poetic. The point here, though, back to changes that are happening in Buddhism in South Asia before they go on elsewhere in the world, is that these new Mahayana interpreters are not just saying that anyone can become a monk, and they're not just saying that there are these bodhisattvas to whom you can pray for special things and who rule over certain realms and things like that. They're also developing a concept of merit or goodness that is transferable to others. So, you can develop this goodness by doing good deeds. You can develop this goodness by donating to the temple. You can make a straight donation, or you can pay a monk to have a certain holy text read out loud in honor of someone or something like that, or to help someone with a disease or some ailment or some obstacle in their life. And the merit that you develop from donating to the temple, from paying to have this thing read out loud, you can transfer your merit, your goodness you've developed. You can transfer that onto, say, a sick person. And in the transfer, you can heal that sick person. Now, that is a new concept. There's none of this in the Buddha's original teachings. This is something that emerges only with the development of Mahayana Buddhism. And temples begin cropping up all throughout India, developed to specifically this way of thinking about Buddhism. Now, we do get a lot of things that are still similar. Monks, for example, cannot work. So what are they doing instead? Well, they're hiring laborers to work on their farms out of the money they're making from donations from people who need to make merit, to transfer that merit onto sick people and anyone else they want to help. So we're developing a system where the temple is beginning to slowly become a kind of economic heart of the community, enabled by this belief that merit can be transferred. And in this transferal of merit that you're buying, you can pay for it with money, but the texts start emerging that encourage the gift of what are called the 7 treasures. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, which I hope you remember means you must be connected to Afghanistan, crystal, coral, pearls, and agate. These pearls come from Sri Lanka in this context. So you can give these things and make just a little bit more merit than if you would if you had given just money. And as all of this is swirling around in South Asia, and all of this is being really, really developed to a high degree in the Khmer Empire, which is, again, northwest India, what becomes Afghanistan, what becomes Pakistan, the Khmer Empire becomes the first of any to start really, really heavily pushing Buddhist missionaries. And Buddhist missionaries is a comparatively rare thing in history against, say, Christian or Muslim missionaries out of the Khmer Empire and into other places, and for our module this time, significantly into China. Our cushions, however, they don't last forever in pushing Buddhism as a way of thinking. So in 260 CE, a group of people called the Sassanians, who are coming out of what will be Iran, they defeat the Kushan rulers and bring the dynasty to a close. This collapses centralized power in South Asia for quite a long time. And we enter again into a period where various dynasties are arising and falling in the following centuries, trying to centralize power but not really being very successful. India is once more, or South Asia I should say, to include everyone, is once more culturally united but politically quite divided, quite decentralized. There is, however, one important dynasty that emerges during this period called the Gupta dynasty, which controlled much of North India from 320 to 600. And they are an interesting people. They're the rulers here. They're very aware of the Mauryan dynasty, which we talked about when we talked about ancient India. And they want to draw on some of the cachet of the Mauryans. So the founder of the Gupta dynasty, he titles himself Chandragupta after the founder of the Mauryan dynasty. His reign dates are 320 to 330, so he's on the throne for about 10 years. And he actually takes his capital and he puts it at Pataliputra, where the Mauryans had ruled from. So they're very self-consciously modeling themselves on other dynasties, other larger dynasties that had come before. Now, like the Mauryans, the Gupta dynasty also begins sort of ruling through sponsoring various kinds of intellectual products and religious things and that sort of thing. So they begin by sponsoring Sanskritic scholars. Sanskrit has cemented itself here and becomes ever more the language of higher learning in South Asia. And it's sort of at this point in competition with another script, another language that we've mentioned in earlier lectures that becomes the language of the Buddha when it moves into Southeast Asia, when you get the sort of split between Mahayana and Hinayana or Theravada Buddhism. That language is Pali, P-A-L-I. Now, Pali is a simpler descendant language of Sanskrit, and it is in comparatively wider use. So Sanskrit and its sponsorship is slowly becoming this kind of language of the elite, a Latin in a European Catholic world, that kind of thing. It's becoming a holy language, whereas Pali is replacing it in many places as your sort of day-to-day secular language. Ennin, for example, meets tons of people, as I've already mentioned, who read and write Sanskrit, all from India, many of them doing this. Ennin is the 800s, the Guptas are done by 600, but they're only by the grace of Gupta and the Gupta dynasty's sponsorship of Sanskrit. But the Gupta dynasty does a lot more that is very important to religious developments in South Asia than just sponsor a written language. They organize their political economy through giving land grants to various kinds of institutions in the rural countryside. So they give land grants to certain Brahmins, they give land grants to certain monasteries of different types, and in some cases they give land grants to entire villages. And the thing is, if you had one of these land grants, then you could do the most important thing that any governing power can do in the pre-modern world. You could collect a tax on an agricultural harvest. So as we get sort of rush of tax collection, we're going to see the development of sort of mathematical principles coming about. We get scribes developing a decimal system all on their own to more accurately record the dimensions of plots of land and take note of what taxes were paid in what kind of way from which harvests. I mean, the birth of all writing comes from tax collectors in Sumer, so why can't tax collectors here be making enormously important mathematical developments, right? We're also seeing here the development of a small circle in their numbers to denote an empty space, an early precursor to the concept of zero, already developed by the Maya, as we've seen in earlier lectures. But I think if you develop it all on your own in isolation, you still get the credit, and that's what's happening here. We also get fantastic scientific breakthroughs from, for example, astronomer and mathematician Brahmagupta, who, he's one of the first in South Asia, if not the first, to develop, understand, and propound upon and teach the concept of both positive and negative numbers, and teach people how to multiply and divide by zero using things like rhyming verses. That's all very well and good, but what does any of it have to do with the rise of Buddhism? The Gupta rulers were going around giving this land, as I said, to sometimes villages, sometimes certain monasteries, but they're also giving it to Brahmins. And Brahmins in our world now in South Asia are busy not just harmonizing the world through their memorization of rituals, but they're conducting rituals to specific gods that were minor in texts like the Rig Veda, but have at this point become major. Gods like Vishnu and Shiva. Again, not very big in the Rig Veda, but huge to Hinduism. And Hindus, some actually claim that Buddha himself was Vishnu in an earlier life. So in ancient times, these Brahmins had conducted rituals and animal sacrifices in large public ceremonies, public displays. They're traveling around a little bit. They're ritualists for hire. In the current time, by which I mean under the Gupta dynasty and so forth, they're sedentary. They're living in and around temples, and they're helping people make offerings through specific rituals to Vishnu and to Shiva and other such gods in these temples. Now, as I said earlier, at home, devotees can go home and sing songs of praise to whatever deity they want to, these songs being known as bhakti. This is cool on its own because, evidence in surviving old languages like Tamil demonstrates that even here we have a need among the people in their private homes to have a direct relationship to their gods, not just this Brahmin-mediated relationship where the Brahmin helps you with the ritual. But anyway, what matters is we have our Brahmin, they are now conducting rituals to Vishnu, Shiva, etc., and they have the ability to collect taxes. So some of this tax goes to their temple in the center, but not all of it. Some of it is retained at home. Some of it is used to develop the temples. Some of it is used to promote this religious system at the expense, of course, of others. You want converts to what you're doing. And so this land grant situation, this change in a tax code, empowers certain religious figures above others and allows them to promulgate their religion above others. Let's keep this in mind. Let's build a little momentum. So we have the Gupta dynasty. It's funding through land grants, the ability to tax agricultural harvests, Brahmin activity. That's in northern India. In southern India, in 907, and in fairness, several centuries after the Gupta dynasty, we have a Tamil-speaking power come up called Chola, kings centered at a place called Chola, Chola. They create their own dynasty in South India, and, their most powerful leaders become those most powerful leaders in this region to again patronize not Buddhist, but Hindu temples. So Hindu is getting another sort of political power injection, another economic injection, and it's going to continue expanding. An example of one such temple is, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, Tanjore Temple. It's a temple to Shiva, and it's very interesting. The innermost chamber of this temple is conceived of as a womb. It is a womb, W-O-M-B, room. It houses a stone lingam, L-I-N-G-A-M, to which people with Brahmin assistance in these rituals make offerings. And lingam in Sanskrit is a sign or a phallus, so it's literally a penis inside a womb room in this temple to Shiva. And it symbolizes human reproduction, so that starts to help us think about what kinds of things people might be praying for in this room. But it also symbolizes the creative forces of the universe and Shiva's hand in that creation, that sort of procreation and reproduction that's always going on in the goings-on of the cosmos. So this Shiva temple, like many others, they're located in agricultural heartlands of southern India. They're located in places that are producing huge rice harvests. So the taxes that these temples, continuing off a tradition that the Guptas started, the taxes these temples are able to extract begin to support thousands upon thousands of Brahmins taken as a whole across various Hindu temples in the region. This allows them to conduct many more rituals, memorize many more texts, because they're living lives of spiritual rigor but economic leisure. They're living off of donations. And not just that, but teach local boys in temple schools, again, advancing their own faith. So this sort of political economic injection becomes the sort of core reason, at least for our class, that you need to know that Hinduism makes it at the expense of Buddhism in South Asia. But the Chola kings aren't done there. They are, like many rulers in South Asia, not very militarily powerful. They're religiously influential. So they control the territory immediately around their capital and maybe a few other large cities, but beyond that, it's all an influence game. Many villages here are self-governing for the most part, but what binds them, my God, what binds them to the Chola kings is not a governor. They're self-governing. It's the temple. The temple to Shiva, the temple to Vishnu, whatever the case may be. That temple is subordinate to the larger temple back in the capital at Chola, and it is through the religious organization that power is exerted to the extent that power needs to be exerted. Chola kings are spiritual overlords. The most successful of these spiritual overlords was named Raja, who conquered much of South India and even went as far as to send armies into Srivajaya, a kingdom and a place that will eventually become, in the 1950s, Indonesia. He does not conquer this territory. He's not trying to expand an empire into Srivajaya. What he's doing is expanding his religious authority, because that's the logic of rule back home. So he's sending out priests into what's going to become insular if you're fancy, Southeast Asia, and he's having them teach the people their Sanskrit, giving them a written language. He's giving them Hindu temples, and he's teaching them principles of Chola governance. Now, the hope, of course, is that donations from these temples will flow back into their home in Chola, but there's no military transfer here. There's no stick. There's no one forcing them to pay tax to a ruler or a local governor who sends that back to a king directly. It's all religious. And there's got to be a lot of buy-in here. I mean, you need to understand what's so important about adopting a new religion. Our rulers here in Srivajaya are gaining new and practical policies for rule that are working for the Chola kings, relative to a South Asian context where most of the time power is not centralized. They're gaining a written language, so that's enormously important for communication, the dispensing edicts, getting information from your hinterlands, all of this. There's really important material reasons to buy into the spread of Hinduism that go beyond, one's ultimate fate and things like that. But I'm not trying to be cynical in saying that one's ultimate fate is not important, just that there are multiple reasons that you would adopt it. Let's get into Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is a very, very, very broad region. It's only a region that makes sense, as a great mentor of mine, Mike Cullinane at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who teaches an Intro to Southeast Asian Civilization course, likes to say, Southeast Asia makes sense because the U.S. State Department says it does, and that's how they organize their funding for universities' centers for the study of X. So that's why Southeast Asia is Southeast Asia, and it's not cut up some different way. There's a little more to it than that, but I really like that kind of definition because it helps us understand how arbitrary it is the way we cut the world up. Southeast Asia is huge. Broad region, there's a mainland, and then about more than 20,000 islands, all encompassing purportedly one coherent place. Travel between islands has forever, until the modern world, been easier than travel over land. So the islands, despite the fact that they're separated by ocean, are in many cases more connected than places that are now neighboring countries on a map, because they're not separated by impassable jungle mountains and things like that. Southeast Asia, typically speaking, is a place that has a problem we saw when we looked at Mesoamerica. It is land rich and people poor. It has a very sparse population. There's about 15 people per square mile by the 1600s. That's very depopulated. They're living in isolated groups in the forest and in the mountains. It's a place that has really heavy monsoons that are incredibly central to its agricultural development and life here. It's a place where if you're in the lowlands outside the mountains, you're working in wet rice paddy agriculture. If you're up in the mountains, you're working with what's called unflatteringly slash and burn agriculture, or flatteringly swidden agriculture. And the basic way that this form of agriculture works is, imagine a circle of territory and cut it into a pie shape. So cut the pie into slices. For 5 to 10, say, years, you are farming one slice of that pie, while everything else is just sort of sitting there. Once you've farmed that slice of the pie until the nutrients are out of the dirt, you move on to the next slice of pie. That has been sitting fallow for a long time. Generations, this next slice of the pie has been allowed to grow just forest. What you're going to do is you're going to cut down that forest. You're going to slash and burn it. And you're going to leave that burned remnants to the best you can on the ground. Why? Because that burning of the forest is going to reintroduce a lot of the nutrients from that plant matter back into the soil. You will then farm that for 5 or 10 years, while the place you just were, that previous piece of the pie, you're not doing anything to it. You're allowing that to return back to forest conditions. So you just imagine yourself, this is a little abstract, but you'll get it, working yourself around those pieces of pie 5 to 10 years at a time, allowing every time you go, forest to just grow wild on where you were before. This is not a system of agriculture that can sustain a ton of people, but we're in a place that is people poor and land rich, so it makes sense that this system of agriculture will develop. In the modern world, people hate this. In the modern world, people who are swidden agriculturalists are often very slightly nomadic. They don't farm in one place. They don't buy a lot of chemical processes. They don't really need state irrigation projects. So in places like, say, Laos, where there's a lot of mountains and a lot of people who would have been practicing this in the 20th century, there's a lot of efforts to vilify it, make it seem terrible. I'm not someone who knows all the science of it. I know it's not sustainable on a very large scale, but nor is it as bad for nature when it was practiced as people who really, really, really want to make money off of irrigation schemes and agricultural, Terminator seeds and things like that. It's not as bad as they want to make it out to be either. So I'm going to use the word swidden because I don't hate it as much as people who use the words slash and burn agriculture do. In this world, people remain semi-mobile for a long time, semi-nomadic, moving around place to place. There's land for days. There's no reason not to if something happens that forces you to move. And we have really a very flat society, a very horizontal society. Not a lot of castes, no equivalent to a caste system, very little in the way of a class system. It is basically an egalitarian place for a lot of what we might call its prehistory. We've got this region, it's very diverse, lots of islands, and remember most of the travel is happening between islands, not over land, but there's people on the land. Everywhere the rule applies, land rich, people poor. This has long been important. Recall when we were doing ancient India, we had Greek merchants in Egypt talking about silk that came from a place called China. How did it get there? It moved through Southeast Asia, over the oceans, through the Indian Ocean, and then eventually into Egypt. So people have been going through Southeast Asia for a very, 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 very long time before it comes up, in the course of our discussions. Merchants and religious travelers then, as they're moving through Southeast Asia, bringing with them Hindu and Buddhist beliefs, are using well-established sea routes. They're kind of funky. So before 350 CE, people would have to cross Southeast Asia by landing their boats at the Isthmus of Kra, perhaps my favorite isthmus ever, and walk with their wares 35 miles overland before resuming their sea voyages into the Gulf of Thailand and then on to wherever they were going, the Philippines, or what becomes the Philippines, Japan, China, etc. Now, the schedules for travel here are a little funky as well. They're determined completely by the winds. You cannot just go wherever, whenever. You have to wait for the monsoons. Travel is governed by the monsoons. So during the spring and summer, monsoon winds would blow toward India. So during the spring and summer, you headed to India. During the fall and winter, they blew away from India. So during the fall and winter, you left India. Ships waiting on the winds to change in Southeast Asia, they'd have several hundred crew members with them, they'd have passengers with them, they'd still need shelter, and they'd be stuck there for 3 to 5 months maybe, waiting on the winds to change so that they can continue on their voyage. This is why in a very famous sort of general history that I would recommend to you, although it's a little dated, it's good, by a historian named Anthony Reed, he calls his history of Southeast Asia the land beneath the winds, because this is where you get stuck, waiting on the monsoons to change, and a lot of this culture comes from people from other larger places getting stuck. So port towns grow where these people are stuck. And they grow around the needs of these people. Local rulers begin taxing travelers, while merchants are founding markets, dealing with goods from China and India, and beginning to slowly work out into, well, hey, what does Southeast Asia have? So they're collecting aromatic woods, they're collecting spices and things like that. They're moving those to India, they're moving those to China, at the same time that they're selling Southeast Asians silk and things like that. After 350, after that year, sea travelers begin skipping the Isthmus of Kra. I love it. I'm going to say it again. The Isthmus of Kra. And using the Strait of Malacca, my second favorite strait. I'm a Cold War guy. The Strait of Taiwan is my favorite strait. But anyway, the Strait of Malacca. They start using this instead, and many would wait for the winds to change in that kingdom we just mentioned, in a place that becomes part of Indonesia, when that's founded in the 20th century, Srivajaya. Local rulers welcomed these new Buddhist merchants and religious folk who were showing up, and they made contributions to these people's temples, both back home and as they started founding them throughout the Strait of Malacca in places like Srivajaya. These rulers in Srivajaya, they called themselves, I love it so much, their names, Lord of the Mountains and Spirits of the Waters of the Sea. Srivajaya is this kingdom that flourishes in this place as this sort of like little node on a trade path, flourishes between 700 and the year 1000. It traded with smaller kingdoms on the island of Java. The world's largest Buddhist monument then occurs on that island. You see a picture of it on this slide, and I'll give you a more detailed picture of it here. It's called Borobudur. It's 100 feet tall. It's 400 feet long on each side. It is itself a square. And the scale of the monument is a sign of the wealth of the kingdom. I'll tell you one fun story about Borobudur. In the 20th century, very famous Indian nationalist, poet, and man of letters, Tagore, travels to Indonesia hearing that, he wants to set right. The British have told us we have no culture, that we're backward, that we're stagnant, and I heard in the past that India was so influential. I want to find proof of it by going to places that India influenced, and Tagore goes to Indonesia, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, but I love it so much. He says, "Everywhere I see India, but I recognize none of it." I love that, and it's a statement about Indic influence throughout this region, which again is not military. It's religious and it's economic. So that's, a very brief skim an overview of how Hinduism and eventually, along the same paths, Buddhism kind of enters insular island, Southeast Asia. But how does it get to the mainland? So images of the Buddha start showing up between 3 and 600 in mainland Southeast Asia. And prior to the arrival of, thinking about the Buddha and Buddhism, different groups recognized certain individuals as what we would call men of prowess. This is a sort of political distinction, and it's so fluid and loose, it gives you a sense of almost everything it is to think about pre-modern Southeast Asia. Men of prowess are people who used military skills or intelligence to rise in the ranks of their particular group in their particular region. They became influential. They ruled almost completely off of their own charisma, their own skill. They created no stable states whatsoever. And when they died, that was it. When they died, that was it. The group might disband, or someone else might come along, or they might stay together in a more egalitarian way. But there's not really any core effort to develop long-lasting state power. Within this political world that is so fluid, you get a belief, as I started the video with, in natural spirits. The natural world is populated by many spirits, and nearly everything has a spirit that populates or lives in that thing or is associated with that thing, whatever it is, a rock, a tree. I showed you at the beginning the inside of a home that was built in the 1980s in Georgia, and guess what? There's a P or a Tevan there, a ghost, a spirit, or an angel there as also part of that land. So in this world, then they begin to develop rituals to communicate with those spirits, and again, I showed you an example of one such ritual at the top of the lecture. Most visitors to this world were coming not from China, but were coming instead from India. Some were Brahmins, some were merchants, that sort of thing. Southeast Asians eventually begin traveling to India themselves to study Sanskrit. This happens, of course, first with Srivajaya, but the mainlanders eventually start doing it again, and for all the same reasons, all of the same buy-ins. You get a written system, you get ideas about governance, you get answers to the big questions about, where do we come from, or how does one live a good life, or how do we deal with their own salvation. As they start to do this, you get a literate population in Southeast Asia that starts bringing with it not just Hindu beliefs, but Buddhism. And so as Buddhism is getting pushed out in India, it's finding adherents in Southeast Asia, and they are either accepting it as it's brought by merchants and religious people to them, or they're going to India and finding it and bringing it back. Literate men, and they are all men, in this world of mainland Southeast Asia are referred to in many of the sort of older, long-lasting kingdoms by a Sanskritic word that goes Purohita. So a Purohita is sort of chief priest. What it means in the mainland Southeast Asian context is an advisor, a ritualist, a teacher. According to the Bhakti, you are encouraged to study with Purohita to get closer to the divine as they worship. So we're getting a bit of a political culture exported here as well. I should say, one thing about the slide here, this is an example of a tree of particular importance in Thailand. You cannot cut it down unless you have the proper spiritual skills, but the only people that have the proper spiritual skills to cut this tree down because of the spirit that lives within it are Buddhist monks. So you can use this wood from this tree in temples, to build things around the temple, because the goodness of the Buddhist monks can fight back against the anger of the spirit for cutting the tree down. And there's absolutely nothing about that spirit in any Buddhist text at all. It's just a mixing of pre-existing Southeast Asian spirit beliefs with Buddhism sitting on top of it. I know that this has been cursory, but I think that is all we really need. Bear in mind, this is one part of a lecture. We still have to get to Tong China. All we really need to see how it all fits together. This is sort of the extension from the Chola. The extension from the Chola kings out to Srivajaya, insular Southeast Asia, then moving on to mainland Southeast Asia, people of prowess and things like this, traveling when they can, out to learn Sanskrit, to learn ideas about Hindu gods, Shiva, Vishnu, etc., learn ideas about Buddhism, to bring those back with them, to mix them with the spirit gods that already exist there. This is a very complicated and syncretic world, but I think we can make sense of it. All of it comes together for us here in the time span covered in Jayavarman II. Now, Jayavarman II rules, he's the first in the dynasty Angkor. He rules the lower Mekong River Basin region from 802 to 850, and he's able to do this materially on the back of the Great Lake, Tonle Sap. This is located in what is now Cambodia, and it is a massive catch basin for the monsoon rains. The Mekong River flows into it, flows out of it until it goes into what is now southern Vietnam and then on into the ocean. Tonle Sap enables an enormous amount of agricultural development, irrigation coming off of this lake. So this is where Jayavarman centers his kingdom, initiating what is called the Angkor period, 802 to 1431, 802 to the end of this class, named for his Angkor dynasty. It's a group whose rulers speak a language called Khmer. I know it's spelled Khmer, Khmer, but it is pronounced Khmer. And Jayavarman here, he mixes it all together. It's amazing what he does here. He comes in and he says, I rule you as a devotee of Shiva. Just as Shiva presides over the known universe, I preside over the human universe. All you chieftains and all your surrounding smaller realms, I preside over you. And I'm not going to conquer you in any sort of firm military sense. It's very decentralized, like our South Asian model. Instead, what I want is to be acknowledged as a purohita, as a teacher, a ritualist, an advisor, a chief priest. I am the one who is like Shiva on earth, and through my rule will bring you closer to Shiva, closer to the divine. I will help you address issues of afterlife, issues of rebirth, issues of the good, as well as material things that we can solve through correct worship in our little protection racket, moving forward, RE harvest, RE childbirth, what have you. He then goes about building temples, but where he locates his temples is fascinating. Where he locates his temples is not just an advantageous geographic spot. It's not just a place where he thinks there will be good resources. He locates his temples in precise locations where there already resides an important local spirit. So a rock with a spirit in it that people have been worshiping for centuries, suddenly that's a temple to Shiva. And suddenly that rock where the spirit lives, that's a lingam inside that temple. This spirit has gone from being its own thing to a penis inside a womb room in a temple to Shiva. The spirit is still there. It is still honored. It has pride of place within this temple to Shiva. But Hinduism has been successfully incorporated into the worship of this spirit. They're living now these religious worlds together. The biggest temple they build you've probably heard of. It's not during his lifetime, it's early 12th century. It is Angkor Wat, or Angkor Temple. And in this world, Jayavarman, while he rules, he's Shiva, the model of Shiva on earth. He's placing these locations where there are already pre-existing spirits. And what does he say he is? He says he is a Buddhist concept that we haven't dealt with since we talked about ancient India. He says he is a Chakravartin. He says he is the turner of the wheel. He is the best lay Buddhist one can be. And he's going to influence people through his great Buddhist power as a Purohita who can bring them all closer to a Hindu god through temples they are worshiping at based on the location of pre-existing spirits. None of that sits well together. And what I hope you can get is that them not sitting well together is the point. That's the thing I want you to draw from our little discussion here of Southeast Asian religious life. In Abrahamic faiths, there is the one God and all things are solved through that God. Whether that, depending on what stage of Abrahamic faith you are, there's ultimate surrender to that God through the Prophet Muhammad, or there is salvation through Christ, or something like that. But it's one tool that smashes or solves or soothes, or however you want to phrase it, all of the problems in your life. Southeast Asian religiosity does not work like that. You've got many arrows in your quiver, you've got many tools in your toolbox, whatever metaphor you prefer. Buddhist monks need to do things like handle spirits. And on the sides of their temples, they're going to have images of Shiva, they're going to have images of Indra, all these deities from Hinduism and the Rig Veda and things like that exist right alongside them. It's very syncretic, it's very pragmatic. What you need, you have. There's a whole host of things that could harm or help you, and you need to navigate that, but you cannot do it with just one tool. You have to do it with a bunch of different tools, and it's okay that they don't all fit together well. It's okay that they contradict each other a little bit. It's okay if there's no scriptural basis for the thing that you're doing, if the thing that you're doing works. If you can learn to sort of accept that, if you can learn to sort of think like that, or at least not have a problem with it, then you're well on your path to understanding the religious world of Southeast Asia, and I am happy, be it in the comments sections on YouTube or in our class, if you're one of my students, to help you think more about that world. But that's all I have for 8.1. It's brief, but it's been fun for me. I'll see you in 8.2.